This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Well, welcome once again to the Stockholm School of Economics here in the Art Nouveau district of Riga. I'm joined by another guest for our podcast in which we speak to people who've been coming to SSE Riga to speak or to give their expertise in some other way. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Agne Suziedelyte, who's originally from Lithuania but is currently based in London. She's an applied econometrician based at City University of London, and you've been here to give a talk about your latest piece of research, Agne.
Right, yes.
And what is the subject of that research, please?
So that particular paper was about a reform in Australia which reduced welfare payments to single mothers. Mm-hmm. So we're exploring what effect that had on the mothers themselves, and in particular we're interested in the effects on the children. So briefly to summarize the results, we do find that it had a positive effect on the mothers in terms of employment and income. So it made mothers more likely to be employed and have higher incomes, which is a positive outcome usually. And then when we look at the young adult outcomes, we also see signs of positive effects in the sense that we see that they are less likely to rely on unemployment benefits when in the early 20s.
Bearing that in mind then, if we could just rewind slightly, that sounds like very clear, data-driven research, but what makes it applied econometrics? I mean, could you just give us a little overview of what this area of research actually is and maybe how it differs from other forms of economics?
Right. So applied part is the fact that we're using data, and econometrics part is the fact that we use what's called econometric methods. So you can also think of the statistical methods applied to economics to analyze this data. So it's different from, for example, descriptive statistics, where you just compute means and other statistics and just summarize the data. We can do very interesting things. You can present graphs and tables, but that usually doesn't allow you to establish, for example, if the relationship between two variables, that's something which we're usually interested in. Is it causal, which means does one thing actually cause the other thing happening, or are they just related, which is interesting, but it's not informative enough when it comes to like policy advice and policy decisions. So usually we want to know if we change something, will it actually lead to a change in the outcome we're interested in. So that's what econometric methods
so in a sense you're sort of diving down into the data a bit deeper and exploring the relationships between the different elements of data rather than using the mass of data to draw a conclusion.
Right, and we're using more complicated and advanced methods to do that.
It sounds like an area that requires quite extensive sort of anthropological and social knowledge, as well as presumably mathematical and that side of things. I mean, how did you end up in this field? What was your path to becoming a specialist in this area?
Well, it all started from my interest in economics. So I've been always studying economics from my bachelor degree. Then I did it also in my master's degree. And then I had a break and started doing PhD in economics. And always comes from this interest to understand how people behave, how they make decisions. And then if we observe people, what can we learn from that, and which can be useful in terms of policy, and what kind of advice for the government, and hopefully in the big picture can make a difference in a positive way. So when we think about economics, a lot of it is about how people make decisions, understanding what affects their decisions, and so a lot of my research is also now about that.
That's very interesting, because I mean, I think that's an aspect of economics which is often forgotten, maybe by the layman, that this is all rather rarefied data and it's all contained in bar charts and graphs, rather than this is a resource which is used by people to make decisions which affect everyone's lives.
Exactly. And even the data, it actually also, when you look at it in detail and if you conduct correct type of analysis, it reveals something about how people make decisions. Or the consequences, what are the consequences of their decisions, of their behaviors.
I was just wondering, when you started to get into this field, were there any particular teachers or figures or books that you read which really sort of turbocharged this interest? Because it does seem to me that when you speak to a lot of academics, there is some kind of thing which suddenly clicks with them and they realize, all right, this is definitely what I want to do. Was there anything like that with you?
Yeah, I would say so. Economics is usually divided into two broad fields. It's microeconomics and macroeconomics. So, and in microeconomics, you deal with individuals and firms, whereas macroeconomics is about the countries, governments, and central banks. So I've been always drawn to the microeconomics just for the reasons I explained, and I had really good lecture in microeconomics, both in my bachelor studies and in master studies. I found the subject interesting, but I think it's the fact that I had just a high quality and enthusiastic lecture that made a big difference as well. So I think that's why it started.
And what was the first piece of research that you delved into? Because sometimes that tells us something as well.
Yeah, so that's related to, so when I came back to the idea of coming back to academia, when I started thinking of applying for a PhD, usually when you do that, you need to submit like a research proposal, meaning some idea for your dissertation. And I don't exactly remember where it came from, but I was at some point very clear that I want to study the effect of internet, how that affects people's decisions, and in particular in the health, in terms of health outcomes. So I wrote that proposal suggesting that I want to study how the information about health on the internet, which is very vast now, how that affects the behaviors related to health and also the health outcomes of people. And that's something that was my first piece of work in my PhD, and I'm still find this topic very interesting. And
it's a bit unfair of me to sort of ask you to summarize that, but could you just give us a couple of pointers as to what you discovered in that research period?
Yeah, so no, I still remember it very well because it's something I still think about and think how can I extend this research further. So it was again based on data, so survey data, where people were asked a lot of questions about how they look for health information. So I could identify or know whether the people use internet to look for health information, and then I was analyzing how that relates to the visits to the doctor. So the hypothesis there is that if you have the source of information, this new source of information, which is internet, you might actually have lower need for the actual doctor visits, because a lot of what happens at the doctor visit is the exchange of information. So you go and you ask questions and the doctor provides information. So it's plausible that now when you can find this information so well, so maybe you need to go to your doctor less frequently.
So presumably people are able to, as an example, people might be able to do a self-diagnosis which would reveal that it wasn't a serious health problem, and they'd be able to treat themselves rather than go through the process of going to the doctor.
Exactly, or maybe just realize it's nothing serious, they don't really need to go to the doctor. So, and that would be kind of a positive story. So
and I guess that would take a certain number away from doctor's visits.
Right, which is usually that's what something we know. Our healthcare system is usually overburdened, and that especially the GPs or primary care physicians, they are overwhelmed with patients, and think also the doctors agree that many of the visits are probably not really necessary, that they can be resolved in other ways. But there's also other side of the story. So and that's what my results showed. I in fact found that these people are more likely they had more doctor visits than the people who are not using internet to look for health information. And the other side is that people just get worried and concerned, and I think they have more questions than they had before. On top of that, there's a lot of information on the internet, and it's of different quality, and you can sometimes find different answers to the same question. So I think people just get quite confused and even more worried than they were before, and they go to the doctor and ask questions.
But that's quite interesting, because it seems to show that the internet cannot replace the doctor, but the doctor actually then becomes the trusted source,
right?
Which the internet is not, even though there's this supposed wealth of information
right,
there.
Yeah, and you probably have to keep in mind that so my study was done in 2000. I was using data from 2003. So mid 2000. So things probably change over time, and the quality of the data hopefully will improve over time. And not only that, but also hopefully what we really need, I think, to help people find the quality information, so they will know what are the trusted sources. So rather than going and looking for different sources, they would just go to that source. So for example, in UK, NHS, the government health provider, has a very good website, and that covers a lot of questions which people might have. So that's when I check the internet for information, that's why I go to, and I think it does answer. And you feel reassured that it's not just somebody sitting there writing. It's an official government organization who is.
And yet, at the same time, now we have things like the anti-vax movement, which is very internet driven. It would be very interesting to see a repeat of your experiment now, and maybe there would be some more serious forms of people not attending, rather than just as a quick diagnosis, like not attending or asking for doctor's advice because they believe there is a conspiracy against them, or because it will actually physically harm them or their child to go to the doctor. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's like a very sensitive topic, because it's your child's health, and you do find this conflicting information. So on one hand, we have the hypothesis that it has negative effects on health. On the other hand, you have kind of expert opinions who deny this. So I think I can understand how they can be confused, but the question is, will they really then trust the doctor if they say it's fine, because they know they also on that other side of the argument. So I don't know if that would clarify. Well, but definitely. Well, that's another aspect. The social media now, it's that's how the news spread, and it has huge impact on people's actual behavior.
Well, speaking of children and children's health, something that you're investigating at the moment is research, I believe I have the title right, Is It Only a Game? Video Games and Violence, which sounds incredibly topical, something that a lot of people are discussing. Could you just talk us through exactly what your research is? I know it's still in progress, and the methodology by which you're addressing this question.
So it's my interest in video games also kind of stemmed from the interest in internet. So when I was looking for more topics to work on, now I have a couple pieces of research on video games, because they're much more complicated, I think, than I thought they were. So just to preview a bit, I have another study where I showed that video games increase problem-solving skills among children. So that's something even I didn't expect before I started looking at this question.
Is this all video games or a specific selection?
Again, this is what we call average effect. So it's on average, any game you pick, it does have a positive effect. It's likely that there's a variation in the positive effects. So it might be not all games, and some games can have very positive effects. But knowing that most children actually play. It's not the problem solving, like the puzzles they play on the internet. It's when they play video games. It's very many of them are action games, and some of them can be violent as well. And I think it's not that surprising, because when you take any game, it is like a problem solving task. So you have a task, you have to solve it, and you have to figure out how to solve it. First, you have to figure out what the task is. It's not always very clear. So I think in any game, most of the games, let's say, you can find this problem-solving element.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's usually integral to the storyline, isn't it, as well?
And that's what makes video game interesting. They are challenging. They're just challenging enough so to keep players interested. So that then led me to this question, which is one of the biggest questions about the video games, and here particularly focusing on violent video games. Because many people are concerned that so many people, and including children, play games which look very violent from outside. And I agree with that. So if you look at, I don't play video games myself, but I did see some demos of the popular video games, and they are really kind of scary. But when you look at research, actually there's no evidence that in fact those video games make people act violently in real life, so that they cause real life violence. So people have strong opinions, but there's no kind of convincing evidence. So and especially what kind of drove me to write this paper is the statements when you see in media where very often in media people who are against video games, so they blame video games for many things. So increasing violence among youth, which is not always also based even on facts, and especially when you have those extreme violent acts, such as shootings, very often in US, there's very often that they link this to the video game playing history of the perpetrator. So, and there are some particular groups such as National Rifle Association, which very often it comes out and kind of points to the video game playing, and they kind of start blaming the video games, and kind of seems to distract from the other possible reasons for that behavior. So I did what I usually do. I took the data, and then I used this data to see is there a relationship.
And what is this data?
So the data again is what's called survey data. So, and this particular data is on children. So, and there are different parts of the survey. So some of the questions are answered by children themselves. So to preview a look at the adolescent children, so I don't really look at very young children, and I'm focused on boys because they are the ones who are mainly playing violent video games. And then the this other set of questions, which is answered by their parents as well. So,
would this be their parents answering if they have observed an increase in violent behavior or something?
So in terms of actual questions about violence, so children themselves are confidentially, which is important, so there shouldn't be nobody else listening to their answers. They are asked, have they hurt anyone seriously enough that they would need medical assistance? So that's kind of the violence we really think of.
So that's serious violence.
Yes, like the violence we're really concerned of. And then there's another question which I also use just as an additional measure, which is have they destroyed school property in the given amount of time? And then the parents ask slightly different questions. So it's like you said, it's about the observations of the behavior, but not necessarily about video games and behavior. They just ask, is it common for the child to be cruel to other children or bully other children? So it's a different question than that asked to children. It's not really necessarily violence per se. Bullying can be mental also.
But
mental
you can see
violence
they're quite
as well.
emotive questions, and wouldn't a lot of parents be reluctant to
Yeah,
admit
exactly.
this anyway?
Yeah, so that's why I trust the answers provided by the parents less than those provided by kids. I think kids tend to be more truthful, especially at that age. And given it's confidential, it's collected confidential, I think they're more likely to say the truth. And you also, when you compare parent and children's answers, they don't really coincide. So you can find children who say, yes, I've hurt somebody, but the parents would not say that they are cruel. It's likely that they don't know, because they observe children, especially when they're adolescents, they observe them only at home, where that's not where the violence happens. And kids probably don't tell their parents very often when they get into fights. So that's the data. And then the information on the video game playing comes from the so-called time diaries. So children are asked to record their activities in a given time period. And so everything they do, they write it down. They tell how much time they spent on each activity, where they were, with whom. So it's quite a detailed and interesting data. And one of the activities is video game playing. So that's what I use. But the main idea is to really kind of answer this question, which is also relevant for government and policymakers. So you really want to see, do we want to restrict access for children to violent video games? Because, and again, the study is based on the US, so it somewhat differs across countries, but in the US, there are no laws which really prevent the retailers selling or renting violent video games to children.
Well, so there are sort of ratings, but they are advisory,
and
are they?
So there's a Video Game Association, which also says, they have some kind of rules which they set for the retailers, that they should respect those ratings and they should not sell the games to the minors, the M-rated games to minors, which are the ones which are violent. But in reality, we know that around 70% of children actually play M-rated video games, although they're not 17 yet. So I want to see what happens if we enforce this strictly. So we find a way to make sure that no child under 17 gets access to a violent video game. And that's why it's interesting, is because that's something where the government potentially can control. You can't really tell the child to play violent video games or not play, because the government only can do as much, but the actual access they can control. So what I actually do, I'll see what happens when there's a new popular violent video game released. And in particular, you can imagine, compare two children. So observe one child who has this violent, and it has to be a popular game just to make an impact, released in the, let's say, past 6 months. Then I compare the child who has not had that happening, so they were not exposed to the new violent video game.
And who are from relatively comparable backgrounds.
Yes, so you also control, or we account for any other differences. So we make them as comparable as possible. And then we see what are the differences in their violence levels between those two children. So that's kind of a thought experiment, what I'm trying to do. And then what you find is possibly unexpected for some people, but it's very plausible as well. So you actually find that after release of a popular violent video game, violence in fact decreases rather than increasing. So not to understand why, you have to backtrack a bit and think of the hypothesis first. What can happen when you have a new game released? So yes, the children play more violent video games, which can have direct effect on the violence, meaning that they make them more violent. It's not certain again, because the psychology theories, they actually, some of them predict an increase in violence. Some of them say that actually you can observe a decrease in violence because children express any negative feelings.
The safety valve type theory.
Exactly. So they release those emotions, and that means they kind of are calmer after playing video game than before. But then the key aspect, and I think that's what's driving the result I find, is what we call it's a substitution effect, which refers to the fact that we have to choose what we do at a particular time. But we can't both play video game and do something else. Mm-hmm. So the child who now has this new game released is or he or she, or let's say he because I look at voice, is very we know that children spend a lot of time, especially in the beginning, playing that video game. That means they're sitting at the home. They could be with their friends, but they're really interested in the game, nothing else. This very absorbing activity, and you forget everything else once you play video game. Whereas the child who doesn't have this video game to play, there could be some other games, but they don't have this new game to captivate them. Yeah. They do whatever they would normally do if they didn't play video games. And very often is for teenage boys, it's just doing nothing. So just hanging around with the friends outside and just getting in trouble just of pure boredom sometimes.
Yeah, as part of their social skills development.
Yeah, and that's what boys do. Yeah. And there's complicated dynamics, and there's certain behaviors expected from young boys. That so I think that's where many fights start. So I'm kind of hypothesizing here, so I don't have proof of that, but that's kind of...
No, it's interesting because in a way it's a little bit parallel with what you were saying about the doctor's situation, and in that because they're doing a different activity, which, as I say, is developing their social skills, going out, just hanging around with other people rather than being locked in their room, staring at a screen and absorbing the images there. That may indeed make them more likely to get into a physical confrontation, let us say, simply because they're with other people. And that's not necessarily a really terrible thing, is it?
But it's also, I think, if they were really engaged in some kind of useful that's the discussion what we have, especially in UK, but where this, not recent, it's got a long observed increase in crime among young boys, mainly coming from, and just because they don't really have alternatives, so they don't really have anything to do. So they say even the sports clubs now are shutting down, and so they just again do nothing. They may be socializing, but in the end it leads to bad outcomes very often. So they start fighting amongst themselves, amongst the different groups, and
but one could almost argue that is a safety valve itself, and that maybe the person who's staying in playing the violent video game, while they may be passive for a very long time, when they do finally explode or they do finally feel a violent impulse, it may be that much worse because they've been desensitized as to what violence really is. I mean, I know that if you actually get punched in the face, you realize that violence is a very bad thing, whereas if you're killing someone repeatedly and they're respawning and there's no consequence to this action, maybe your idea of violence is rather romanticized.
So it's all possible. So it's all the hypotheses can raise before you look at the data. But when you look at the findings, the results they find, it actually does not corroborate with the story. So it's and more corroborates the story that it's safer, it seems, for these children. And it's not only behavior just when they play video games, because it's the actual violence is measured over a number of months. So if they stop playing video game and then they leave home and they're more likely to engage in violence, that would show up in the data. Right. But that's not what you find. But
this is physical acts of violence. I mean, it doesn't. It's not sort of psychometric data about their internal psychology, whether that's
or
been
like
changed.
Emotional state or not. So no, that's very much possible that it's possible that video game playing actually agitates youth. So that if you measure emotional state just after they play video games, that they might be more kind of agitated and more have in this kind of heightened.
We'll have a bit of adrenaline pumping.
Yes. But it seems that does not translate into actual violence. That's what the results show. It could be because, again, the home environment where they really don't have opportunities to release that violence, or it could be just that this is a very short-lived kind of effect. So it goes up and then it goes down. So, and that's kind of consistent to what psychologists find in the based on experiments that they run with children. So it's very kind of controlled setting. So they have children divided into groups. One group plays violent video games, other one plays non-violent games for let's say 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then they let them just kind of hang around after the video game playing for another 10 minutes, and they observe, do they look like they act more aggressively to other children? Are they more likely to pick aggressive toys? And they usually find that they do. So, and then they use those findings to say, yes, look, video game playing is bad and they cause violence. But this is a very controlled environment, not taking all those complicated
so it's maybe extrapolating a bit too far.
Exactly. So, and I think my findings and their findings are not inconsistent. So it's very much possible that there is this initial effect or this heightened emotional state, but it either doesn't last, or it's just the environment which kids are once they stop playing video games. It just does not. It's not conducive to violence.
And have you had any reaction to your sort of initial findings? Because I can imagine that this is the sort of research which is going to get jumped on by all sorts of different people. I mean, not least the game manufacturers themselves, perhaps.
Well, I'm sure people will have different opinions about it. So it's so the paper was not hasn't been publicly available yet. So actually, I did put it on my website on the public domain today, just because we're talking about it. So it will be interesting to see what reactions. I expect very mixed reactions. So from just talking to people and presenting it, this research, I find that some people are not surprised because it's mainly the people who have played video games, and they say, well, yeah, of course, the video games they make people violent, and then some people just can't believe them, and they kind of try to find reasons why this can be true and what's wrong with my studies. So, and it's perfectly normal. I think it's usually when you look at such a controversial topic and you find possibly unexpected results for some people, then you get very different very heightened discussions after.
I do remember reading recently, actually, something which really struck me on this same subject. It was a mother who had noticed that her son was playing a lot of violent video games, and often was playing it with his father as well. And she decided to just see exactly what it was they were doing, and maybe she would sit in instead of the father and play the game with her son. And it was one of these sort of warfare games where there were multiple killings and so on, and very bloody explosions and that kind of thing. And she sat there and played it with him, and her conclusion, I thought, was brilliant, which was I'm not worried about him playing these violent video games now. I think it's just something that's going to appeal to boys of his age. But the thought that my husband wastes his time doing this, I find absolutely disgusting.
Unnecessary.
I thought that summed it up quite well. Anyway.
Sorry, just to conclude, I guess one disclaimer is, so it's in my conclusion, so don't say that we should. My recommendation is not for everyone to start playing violent video games, so particularly adults and boys that start playing violent video games, because that will reduce violence. And that's a bit of a fast stretch. The limited things we can say based on those results. But one thing I think we can say that if we restrict access to violent video games to children, we can have perverse or kind of those unexpected effects of increasing violence, although we have, and it's not uncommon for policies to have good intentions, but then they have those unexpected opposite effects. So
and I
think that could be one of the cases.
We could at least take some sort of solace, maybe from your research, that at least if people generally playing some of these violent video games, it doesn't mean they're necessarily immediately going to go out and be violent.
Yeah, exactly.
Left, right, and centre.
Again, it's people are very mixed, and children are very mixed. Those overall effect, and probably if you look at particular children, you would find differences. But on average, if we especially care about the policy changes and effects, that's what the expectation is.
Well, Agne, thank you very much for joining me at SSE Riga here today. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear about your research, and good luck with concluding it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSE Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSE Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.